He had never been checkmated in public before, and in less than 30 minutes, the entire room would forget how to breathe. The grand ballroom of the Harrington Chess Invitational shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off polished marble floors and the glossy black boards arranged in perfect rows across the stage. Cameras from 3 major networks stood ready near the velvet ropes, and a crowd of nearly 400 spectators filled the seats, their low murmurs blending into a hum of anticipation. At the center of it all stood Ethan Caldwell, America's reigning chess grandmaster, 45 years old, tall, confident, dressed in a tailored navy suit that matched the velvet backdrop embroidered with gold lettering. His name alone could fill a hall like this. He moved from board to board in a simultaneous exhibition, defeating 10 opponents at once, his steps measured, his expression calm, almost bored. To him, this wasn't competition. It was theater. 30 minutes earlier, as he circled the stage, his gaze drifted beyond the velvet ropes and settled on a woman standing near the back wall. Clara Whitmore didn't look like someone who belonged at an elite invitational. She wore a soft gray cardigan over a plain white blouse, dark slacks, and low black flats that made no sound against the marble. Her light brown hair was pulled into a simple knot at the base of her neck. A lanyard hung from her collar, identifying her as event staff. She had spent the afternoon quietly aligning boards, adjusting digital clocks, and replacing captured pieces into neat velvet trays. Most guests never noticed her. That was fine with Clara. She had grown used to being overlooked. But she wasn't watching the chandeliers or the cameras. Her eyes were fixed on the boards, following each move with unsettling precision, as if she could see 5 moves ahead without effort. Ethan noticed the intensity in her gaze and mistook it for curiosity. A faint smile curved his lips. As laughter rippled from a table where he had just forced a resignation, he paused near the edge of the stage and raised his voice just enough for the front rows to hear. "You seem very interested," he called out, gesturing toward Clara with casual amusement. "Why don't you join us? It might be entertaining." A few spectators chuckled, assuming it was part of the show. The cameras pivoted. Instinctively, Clara blinked, caught in the sudden beam of attention. She didn't protest. She didn't smile. She simply stepped forward, her movements steady, almost serene. Ethan gestured toward an empty chair at a spare board positioned slightly off-center. A side table meant for demonstrations, not serious play. 5 minutes, he added lightly, adjusting his cufflinks. That should be more than enough. The crowd settled into their seats, sensing diversion rather than danger. Ethan returned to the center, confidence radiating from him like heat from stage lights. What he saw was a quiet event assistant. What he failed to see was the discipline in her posture, the way her fingers hovered over the pieces without touching them, the way her eyes mapped the board as if it were familiar territory. He thought he had invited a joke onto the stage. He had no idea he had just invited the only person in the room who wasn't impressed by him. Clara Whitmore took her seat without ceremony, smoothing the edge of her gray cardigan as though she were settling in for a routine task rather than stepping into the center of a nationally televised exhibition. The overhead lights cast a soft glow across the board, illuminating the crisp contrast of black and white squares. The digital clock beside them blinked 5 o'clock for each side, its faint electronic hum barely audible beneath the rustle of the audience. Ethan Caldwell did not sit immediately. He remained standing for a moment, studying her with polite curiosity, the same way one might observe a volunteer at a charity event. "White or black?" he asked, his tone light, almost indulgent. Clara glanced at the pieces, then met his eyes for the first time. Her expression was calm, neither defensive nor eager. "Black is fine," she replied quietly. A few people in the front rows exchanged amused looks. Taking black meant moving second, responding rather than initiating. Ethan nodded, clearly pleased. He sat, adjusted his cufflinks once more, and advanced his king-pawn 2 squares forward with practiced confidence. The movement was smooth, deliberate, the kind of opening that signaled authority rather than experimentation. A murmur of recognition rippled through the more seasoned players in the crowd. Clara did not react to the murmur. She studied the board for 3 full seconds, then mirrored his tempo with a measured response, sliding her pawn forward to challenge the center. Her fingers released the piece gently, without flourish. The clock ticked. Ethan returned to his feet and paced once around the table before making his second move, developing his knight with effortless speed. He had performed this sequence thousands of times. To him, this was muscle memory. To the audience, it was familiar brilliance. Clara's gaze followed the knight's path, her posture straight but relaxed. She moved her own knight into position, not hurried, not hesitant. The pieces began to populate the center of the board like quiet declarations of territory. 5 moves in, Ethan leaned slightly closer, his confidence intact, but his eyes sharpening with faint curiosity. She was not flustered. She was not improvising. She was responding with structure. A bishop developed. A pawn advanced. Each of Clara's moves carried subtle intention, reinforcing her position without revealing her plan. The commentators near the stage lowered their voices, their playful tone replaced with something more attentive. Ethan attempted a minor exchange, offering a trade that would simplify the position and accelerate the end. Clara declined with a calm repositioning that preserved tension in the center. It was a small decision, but it changed the energy around the board. Ethan sat down fully now, resting his elbows lightly on the table. For the first time, he looked at her not as a diversion, but as an opponent. The crowd sensed it too. The laughter had faded. Even the photographers adjusted their lenses more carefully. Clara reached for her next piece, paused for the briefest fraction of a second, and advanced it into a square that appeared modest at first glance, but quietly limited Ethan's options. He froze mid-reach, hand hovering above his queen, recalculating. The room did not erupt. It did not gasp. It simply grew still. And in that stillness, something shifted that no one had expected. The silence around the board thickened, no longer casual but charged, as though the air itself had begun to calculate. Ethan Caldwell withdrew his hand slowly from above his queen, choosing instead to castle kingside, a safe and traditional decision that drew a few subtle nods from seasoned players in the audience. It was a stabilizing move, one that suggested patience, but there was a faint stiffness in his posture now. Clara Whitmore did not look at the crowd. She did not look at the cameras that had edged closer. Her focus remained entirely on the 64 squares before her. She advanced a pawn on the flank, a quiet move that seemed almost modest, yet it carried a deeper intention, reinforcing her structure while quietly preparing space for her pieces to breathe. The digital clock dipped under 3 minutes for each side, its numbers glowing red against the polished wood. Ethan leaned forward, studying the position with narrowed eyes. What had begun as a light exhibition was evolving into something layered, something resistant. He initiated a tactical sequence, sliding his bishop along a diagonal to apply pressure near her king. It was a probing strike, testing her awareness. Clara responded not with retreat, but with coordination, developing her rook to connect her defenses, her movements steady and precise. There was no wasted motion in her hands, no nervous tapping, no glance toward the audience for reassurance. She played as though the ballroom did not exist. 10 moves in, the position had transformed into a complex web of tension. Ethan attempted a central break, pushing a pawn forward to open lines, confident that sharper play would expose inexperience. The soft click of wood against wood echoed faintly across the marble floor. Clara paused, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, her eyes scanning not just the move but the idea behind it. Then she did something unexpected. Instead of closing the center, she allowed it to open, but only on her terms. She captured in a way that redirected the tension, inviting an exchange that appeared equal on the surface but shifted the balance subtly in her favor. A few heads in the front row tilted forward. The commentators stopped whispering altogether. Ethan reached for his knight, hesitated, and recalculated. For the first time that evening, he checked the clock before making his move. 2 minutes and 12 seconds. He repositioned the knight, choosing activity over caution. Clara's reply came more quickly now. She placed her bishop on a long diagonal that sliced across the board like a line of quiet inevitability. It did not threaten immediate disaster. It threatened something worse. Control. Ethan exhaled slowly, a sound barely audible but visible in the slight rise and fall of his shoulders. He adjusted in his chair, no longer performing for the audience but calculating in earnest. The board had simplified, yet the tension had grown. Clara's pieces worked together with unspoken coordination, each one guarding, supporting, anticipating. Ethan made another assertive move, pushing his rook forward to create counterplay along the open file. It was bold, confident, and just slightly overextended. Clara studied it for a full 5 seconds. Then she moved her queen 1 square to the left. It was a small motion, almost delicate, but it aligned her forces with unmistakable clarity. Ethan froze again, eyes tracing the new geometry of the position. The realization did not come all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a door opening to a room he had not intended to enter. The crowd sensed it before they understood it. The balance of the board had shifted, and the Grandmaster was no longer guiding the narrative. He was reacting to it. The moment Ethan Caldwell realized he was no longer steering the game, a subtle tension crept into his movements. He leaned back slightly, folding his arms for a brief second, as if distancing himself from the board might reveal a clearer picture. The ballroom, once filled with murmurs and scattered laughter, had grown so quiet that the faint ticking of the digital clock felt amplified, each second slipping away with quiet insistence. 1 minute and 48 seconds remained on his side. Clara Whitmore sat upright, hands resting calmly in her lap, her eyes steady and unblinking. She was not rushing him. She did not need to. Ethan advanced his rook further along the open file, committing to the aggressive plan he had initiated moments earlier. It was a move designed to create complications, to introduce chaos into a position that had become uncomfortably precise. A few spectators nodded approvingly, recognizing the boldness. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly as he pressed the clock. Clara leaned forward, studying the new alignment of pieces. From a distance, it might have looked balanced. Equal material. No obvious threats. But chess at this level was rarely about what was obvious. It was about what was inevitable. Clara's fingers hovered briefly above her knight before shifting instead to her pawn. She advanced it 1 square, a move so understated that several in the audience blinked, unsure why it mattered. But it mattered. That single square restricted Ethan's rook, subtly cutting off an escape route that had existed seconds before. Ethan saw it. His eyes flicked to the edge of the board, then back to the center. For the first time, he reached for his water glass and took a measured sip. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the sheen of focus across his expression. He adjusted his posture, leaning closer now, calculating variations with increased intensity. 58 seconds. He moved his queen, aiming to generate counterplay near Clara's king, attempting to complicate the position enough to reclaim initiative. The piece landed with a soft click. Clara's response came after a pause that felt deliberate but not strained. She repositioned her rook, aligning it with her queen in a way that created harmony across the board. The geometry shifted again, lines intersecting with quiet authority. Ethan's eyes widened almost imperceptibly as he traced the diagonal of her bishop and the file controlled by her rook. The space around him seemed to shrink. 34 seconds. He moved quickly now, pushing a pawn in what appeared to be a final attempt to open lines and generate threats. The clock dipped under 20 seconds. Clara did not match his urgency. She studied the board one last time, her breathing even, her expression unchanged. Then she lifted her queen. The movement was smooth, controlled, almost gentle. She placed it onto a square that connected every thread she had been weaving since the middle game. "Check," she said softly. The word carried clearly through the silent hall. Ethan froze mid-reach, his hand suspended inches above his king. He scanned the board once, then again, searching for an escape square, a blocking move, a sacrifice that might prolong the inevitable. There was none. His rook was trapped by the pawn he had underestimated. His bishop cut off by the quiet diagonal he had ignored. His own aggression had sealed the final path. The realization settled slowly across his face, not dramatic, not explosive, but undeniable. 10 seconds remained on his clock, though time no longer mattered. The room did not cheer. It did not gasp. It simply held its breath as the Grandmaster stared at the position he could not undo. The seconds on Ethan Caldwell's clock slipped from 10 to 9, then to 8, glowing red against the dark casing as though counting down something larger than a game. His eyes moved rapidly across the board, searching for an unseen resource, a defensive tactic buried beneath the layers Clara Whitmore had constructed with such quiet patience. He leaned closer, elbows near the table now, his earlier Composure replaced by raw calculation. The ballroom remained utterly still. Nearly 400 people watched without a whisper, the chandeliers casting soft reflections across the polished marble floor like frozen light. Ethan reached toward his king, paused, then shifted his hand to a pawn, reconsidering. He scanned again. There was no square to run to, no piece that could interpose without collapsing the entire structure. Clara's queen stood poised with calm authority, supported by a bishop that cut diagonally across the board and a rook that sealed the final file. It was not a flashy attack. It was complete. 5 seconds. Ethan's jaw tightened. For the first time that evening, the confidence that had defined his posture faltered. He pressed his lips together and exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible but visible in the subtle rise of his shoulders. He understood. The position was lost. Not because of a sudden mistake, but because of a series of small assumptions. Assumptions about who she was, about what she knew, about what she could see. 3 seconds. The digital clock blinked insistently. Ethan looked up at Clara, perhaps expecting triumph, perhaps expecting satisfaction. He found neither. Her expression remained composed, almost gentle, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. She was not gloating. She was waiting. 1 second. Before the clock could expire, Ethan tipped his king sideways with quiet deliberation, the universal gesture of resignation. The soft click of the wooden piece touching the board echoed louder than any applause could have. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The commentators remained silent. The cameras held their frame. The air itself seemed suspended. Then a faint murmur swept across the front rows, not laughter this time, not amusement, but disbelief turning into respect. Ethan straightened in his chair, smoothing his suit jacket instinctively, as though reclaiming some fragment of control. He extended his hand across the board. Clara met his gesture with a steady handshake, her grip firm but unassuming. There was no dramatic speech, no declaration. She simply nodded once and began resetting the pieces with practiced efficiency, aligning each pawn and bishop as carefully as she had earlier that afternoon. The Grandmaster rose slowly, stepping back from the table that had moments ago been a stage for spectacle and had become instead a mirror. The room remained quiet, not out of shock anymore, but out of recognition. They had witnessed something rare. Not just a defeat, but a correction. Ethan glanced at the board one final time before turning away, the weight of realization settling without protest. He had invited her forward as entertainment. He left understanding that the quiet ones are not empty spaces waiting to be filled. They are entire worlds waiting to be underestimated. And that evening, beneath crystal chandeliers and national cameras, the loudest sound in the grand ballroom was the silence he could not outplay. The applause did not erupt immediately. It began as a single pair of hands somewhere in the middle rows, a measured and thoughtful rhythm that cut through the silence without shattering it. Then another joined, and another, until the grand ballroom filled with a rising wave of acknowledgement that felt less like celebration and more like recognition. Clara Whitmore finished aligning the final rook on the board and stepped back, her posture unchanged, as though she had merely completed a routine assignment. The cameras that had once hovered with playful curiosity now tracked her movements with quiet respect. Ethan Caldwell remained near the table for a moment longer, absorbing the shift in atmosphere. He was a man accustomed to applause, to admiration that arrived automatically. This was different. This was not about him. He cleared his throat softly and faced the audience, offering a brief nod that carried more humility than any words could have expressed. When he turned back to Clara, his voice was steady but stripped of its earlier amusement. "That was exceptional," he said, loud enough for the microphones to catch. There was no sarcasm, no performance, just acknowledgement. Clara inclined her head slightly. "Thank you," she replied, her tone calm and even. A tournament official approached the stage, visibly uncertain whether to treat the moment as an exhibition footnote or a headline. The commentators, who had once prepared light-hearted remarks about an event assistant facing a grandmaster, now exchanged glances that signaled something larger had occurred. Clara stepped away from the spotlight, moving toward the side of the ballroom where the staff stations were set up. As she passed the velvet ropes, a few guests shifted in their seats, watching her with a new kind of curiosity. Not invasive, not skeptical, respectful. Ethan followed her with his eyes for a brief second before addressing the crowd again. Chess, he said carefully, has a way of revealing what we overlook. The statement lingered in the air, simple yet weighted. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The board behind him still displayed the final position, Clara's queen anchored in quiet dominance, every supporting piece placed with intention. A young player seated in the front row stared at the arrangement as if trying to memorize it, not just as a pattern of pieces, but as a lesson. Clara reached the side table where she had earlier arranged score sheets and spare clocks. She removed her staff badge and set it down gently beside the neatly stacked programs. There was no grand announcement of her history, no dramatic reveal of titles or trophies. Her skill had spoken clearly enough. Ethan eventually stepped off the stage, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. He paused near her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. I misjudged you, he admitted. Clara met his gaze without triumph. You misjudged the board, she answered quietly. The faintest hint of a smile touched her lips, not mocking, not proud, but certain. Across the ballroom, the chandeliers continued to shimmer, unchanged by the shift in power that had just unfolded beneath them. Yet everyone present felt it. The lesson was not loud. It did not demand attention. It simply existed, undeniable and steady. And long after the applause faded and the cameras powered down, the story that traveled beyond those marble floors would not be about spectacle. It would be about the moment a room learned that humility is the only move that never backfires. The ballroom did not return to its earlier noise. Even as conversations slowly resumed and guests rose from their seats, there remained a careful tone in the air, as though everyone was aware they had witnessed something that did not need exaggeration. Clara Whitmore moved quietly along the perimeter of the hall, collecting unused score sheets and stacking them with the same steady precision she had shown at the board. A few attendees approached her hesitantly, offering brief compliments, their voices softer than before. She responded with polite nods and simple thanks, never expanding the moment into something larger than it was. Near the stage, Ethan Caldwell stood in conversation with a group of tournament sponsors, yet his attention drifted more than once toward the side of the room where Clara worked. The weight of the loss had not humiliated him. It had clarified him. For years he had commanded rooms with authority, believing experience alone entitled him to define the narrative. Tonight, the narrative had corrected itself. After the final simultaneous games concluded, the event organizer stepped to the microphone and thanked the guests for attending. There was a brief pause before he added, almost thoughtfully, that unexpected brilliance often appears in the most unassuming forms. The line drew another round of applause, this time directed not at the stage but toward Clara, who instinctively lowered her gaze. She did not step forward. She did not seek the spotlight. She simply continued placing chess clocks into their padded cases, her movements unhurried. Ethan eventually crossed the marble floor toward her once more. Without cameras now, without microphones, he spoke in a tone stripped of performance. Have you competed professionally? He asked. Clara slid a final board into its case before answering. A long time ago, she said. When I was younger. There was no bitterness in her voice. Only history. Ethan studied her expression, sensing the depth behind the simplicity. Why stop? He asked. Clara paused, considering. Life moves, she replied gently. But the board stays the same. The statement lingered, simple yet profound. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding that not all mastery demands an audience. Around them, staff members began dimming sections of the chandelier lighting, casting the hall in a softer glow. The grandeur of the evening faded into something more intimate. A teenage player who had watched the entire match approached Clara shyly, holding a notepad. Would you sign this? He asked, his voice careful. Clara hesitated, then accepted the pen. She signed her name neatly, nothing more, handing it back with a quiet smile. The boy looked at her as though memorizing not just her face, but her composure. Ethan observed the exchange with quiet reflection. He had spent years being the symbol of excellence in rooms like this. Tonight, excellence had looked different. It had worn a gray cardigan. It had spoken softly. It had moved without spectacle. As the final guests exited into the cool night air, the marble floor echoing with distant footsteps, the story of the evening settled into something lasting. Not a scandal, not a spectacle, a recalibration. Clara gathered her belongings and stepped toward the exit without ceremony. Ethan watched her leave, not as a defeated rival, but as a reminder. The quiet ones do not need to announce their strength. They simply wait for the right square, and when it appears, they move. The cool night air greeted Clara Whitmore as she stepped out of the grand ballroom and onto the wide stone steps of the Harrington Center. The city skyline stretched beyond the parking lot, glass towers reflecting the last traces of evening light. Inside, the chandeliers were dimming one by one, their brilliance fading into memory. Outside, everything felt ordinary again. Clara adjusted the strap of her modest leather bag over her shoulder and descended the steps without looking back. She had arrived that afternoon as event staff. She was leaving the same way. Behind her, the heavy doors opened once more. Ethan Caldwell emerged, his suit jacket draped neatly over his arm now, the cool breeze brushing against the crisp white of his shirt. For a moment, he simply stood there, watching her cross the sidewalk toward the employee parking area. There were no reporters waiting outside. No flashing cameras. The spectacle had ended indoors. What remained was quieter, more personal. He walked down the steps at an unhurried pace and stopped several feet from her. "Clara," he called gently. She turned, her expression composed, as though she had expected nothing and yet was not surprised. The streetlights cast a soft glow across the pavement, illuminating the calm in her eyes. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second, searching for words that did not sound rehearsed. "You should not be setting up boards," he said finally. "You should be sitting at them." Clara studied him carefully, not offended, not flattered. "There is more than one way to love the game," she replied. Her voice carried the same steadiness it had at the board. Ethan nodded slowly. He understood now that mastery did not always chase recognition. Sometimes it chose silence. "If you ever decide to compete again," he added, "the circuit would welcome you." It was not a grand gesture. It was not an offer of charity. It was respect. Clara gave a small, thoughtful smile. "I will consider it," she said. A car engine started in the distance. The world continued as it always had. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rivalry that had briefly formed between them had dissolved into something more balanced. Ethan extended his hand once more, not as a grandmaster, not as a public figure, but as a peer. Clara shook it with the same quiet firmness. There was no audience now to interpret the gesture. Only the two of them beneath the soft hum of streetlights. When she turned and walked toward her car, Ethan did not call after her. He did not need to. He watched until the headlights flickered on and the vehicle eased out of the lot, disappearing into the city traffic. Inside the Harrington Center, staff members finished stacking chairs and folding velvet ropes. The stage where confidence had once commanded applause now stood empty. Yet something intangible lingered in the space. A recalibration. A reminder. Ethan looked back at the building one last time before adjusting his jacket over his shoulder. He had entered the evening expecting entertainment. He left with perspective. And somewhere in the quiet rhythm of the city beyond those marble floors, a truth had settled into place. Strength does not announce itself. It waits. It studies. And when the moment is right, it moves without needing anyone's permission. The city absorbed Clara Whitmore's car as if it had always belonged to the night, its red tail lights fading into a steady stream of traffic beneath streetlights that hummed softly above the pavement. Inside the Harrington Center, the final echoes of the evening dissolved into routine sounds. Folding chairs clicking shut, velvet ropes unhooked, the distant whir of a floor buffer gliding across marble. What had felt monumental only an hour earlier now settled into memory, yet the impact lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Ethan Caldwell remained outside for several moments after Clara disappeared from view, the cool air pressing lightly against his skin. He was not replaying the final position in search of errors. He knew exactly where the turning point had occurred. It had not been a single dramatic blunder. It had been a quiet underestimation, a smile meant to entertain, an invitation meant to amuse. He walked back up the wide stone steps and paused at the entrance, glancing through the glass doors at the empty stage. The board had been cleared. The pieces were back in their velvet-lined case. But the lesson remained. Across town, Clara parked her car in the small lot outside her modest apartment building. The engine quieted, and for a moment she sat in stillness, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. She did not reach for her phone to check social media. She did not search for headlines. She had never needed an audience to validate her understanding of the game. Instead, she gathered her bag and stepped out into the calm night, the faint scent of rain lingering in the air. Upstairs, a wooden chessboard rested on her kitchen table, mid-game from a position she had been analyzing earlier in the week. She turned on a small lamp, its warm light illuminating the familiar grid of 64 squares. Without hesitation, she resumed the variation she had left unfinished, moving a knight with the same quiet certainty that had silenced a ballroom hours before. Meanwhile, word of the exhibition traveled quickly among the local chess community. Not exaggerated, not distorted, but retold with an element of awe. It was not the defeat of a grandmaster that fascinated them most. It was the composure, the restraint, the absence of spectacle. By morning, a handful of emails would sit in Clara's inbox, invitations from clubs and tournament organizers who had heard whispers of what happened under crystal chandeliers. She would read them carefully, thoughtfully, without urgency. Back at the Harrington Center, Ethan finally stepped into his waiting car. As the driver pulled away from the curb, he leaned back against the seat and looked out at the city lights. He had built a career on anticipating moves 5, sometimes 10 steps ahead. Yet the most important realization of the evening had required no calculation at all. Respect is not something granted by titles or applause. It is something earned in moments when pride steps aside. Somewhere between the marble floors and the quiet apartment lamp, between the applause and the silence that followed it, a truth had settled firmly into place. The strongest move on any board is not domination. It is humility. And that night, the world remembered what quiet brilliance looks like.